Ultra-processed foods create patterns of addictive-like eating that affect both teenagers and adults, but the vulnerabilities, consequences, and long-term risks differ sharply by age. What makes these foods so dangerous is that they are engineered, quite deliberately, to exploit the brain's reward circuitry. Their concentrated sugar, salt, and fat content creates rapid dopamine surges followed by crashes that trigger cravings, loss of control, and compulsive overeating. Over time, these repeated cycles rewire neural pathways in ways disturbingly similar to behavioral addictions. When these patterns begin early in life, the damage compounds across decades, making processed food addiction one of the most underestimated drivers of modern metabolic decline. Teenagers are especially susceptible because their brains are still developing, particularly the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for impulse control, long-term decision-making, and reward regulation. At the same time, the brain's reward system is hypersensitive during adolescence. This combination makes ultra-processed foods uniquely powerful in shaping teenage behavior. When teens consume high-sugar drinks, fast food, packaged snacks, and desserts, they experience intense dopamine spikes. These surges reinforce habit loops more strongly than in adults, meaning teens can develop addictive patterns of eating much faster. The inability to fully regulate impulses makes it harder for teens to stop eating once they start, and the constant exposure to food advertising further strengthens these neural connections. When teens repeatedly rely on ultra-processed foods to manage emotions, stress from school, social anxiety, boredom, or digital overstimulation, they begin associating these foods with emotional relief. Over time, cravings intensify, tolerance increases, and the brain requires more of these foods to achieve the same reward. This early neural programming sets the stage for lifelong struggles with overeating, obesity, and metabolic dysfunction. Adults, on the other hand, face a different but equally dangerous form of vulnerability. While their impulse control is stronger, the pressures of adulthood, chronic stress, financial strain, time scarcity, emotional burnout, and poor sleep make them seek quick comfort and predictable pleasure. Ultra-processed foods deliver both. The dopamine response may be slightly less intense than during adolescence, but adults are more likely to use these foods habitually, often without awareness. Emotional dependence becomes deeper with age because adults turn to food to manage long-term stressors, workplace exhaustion, caregiving responsibilities, loneliness, or unresolved anxiety. Overeating becomes a coping mechanism rather than a momentary lapse, and once these patterns set in, breaking them becomes extremely difficult. Moreover, adults often normalize these habits, late-night snacking, binge eating after stressful days, relying on sugary or salty foods for energy boosts, without recognizing the underlying addiction. The long-term consequence is more severe metabolic disruption, weight gain, insulin resistance, inflammation, and cardiovascular strain, all accelerated by habitual exposure to hyperpalatable foods. One of the most alarming distinctions between teens and adults is the long-term impact of early exposure. When addictive eating begins in adolescence, the neural pathways involved in reward and self-regulation may be shaped around ultra-processed foods for decades. This increases the likelihood of adult obesity, binge eating tendencies, and compulsive overeating, even in individuals who attempt to diet later on. The brain simply remembers and repeats the patterns it was taught early. Adults who develop food addiction later in life face a different barrier: chronic metabolic damage. Their bodies respond more dramatically to sugar spikes, fat overload, and salt-driven fluid retention. They may gain weight faster, experience deeper blood sugar fluctuations, and face steeper health consequences from the same addictive behaviors that teens display more easily, but tolerate more physiologically. Across life stages, ultra-processed foods create a dangerous cycle: intense cravings, temporary reward, rapid crashes, increased appetite, and escalating consumption. But the risks escalate with time. What feels like harmless snacking in the teen years can harden into full-scale dependence by adulthood. And for adults already living with stress, inflammation, or metabolic dysfunction, these foods become harder to resist and more damaging with every passing year. The trajectory is sobering. Early addiction leads to lifelong struggles with appetite regulation. Midlife addiction leads to chronic disease, and long-term reliance on ultra-processed foods progressively weakens mental clarity, metabolic health, and emotional resilience. The warning is stark. Ultra-processed foods do not merely encourage overeating. They actively reshape the reward centers of the brain in ways that mimic addiction. Teenagers are vulnerable because their brains are still forming. Adults are vulnerable because stress and metabolic fragility make them dependent. In both cases, the long-term consequences are profound, and once addiction patterns take hold, reversing them becomes a slow, uphill battle. Ultra-processed foods may feel comforting or convenient in the moment, but their addictive nature quietly undermines health, autonomy, and well-being over time, trapping people in cycles that become harder to break as they age.